Hello and welcome back to Survey of Biology, and we're going to start the first section of our 8th unit today on population growth, which is a huge issue today as the world's population is now over 7 billion. This diagram's a little bit out of date, just under 7 billion, but we're over 7,100,000,000 now, and so with the resources and everything else, it's a good time to take a look at how populations grow and what can be done to kind of keep them in check and how that plays out in nature. So a population, first of all, is just a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area at the same time. One of the key things here is of the same species. So we're talking about just humans, just giraffes, just elephants or something, but they're in the same area at the same time. And population growth is driven by two things. Number one is going to be births, so the number of new individuals that are born into that population, and then also immigrants, so individuals that will migrate into that population. And with the human population, it's very easy to see that there are people coming into the United States or any country that you can think of. People are going to move, so there's immigration. Now, population decline can have the opposite too. So populations will decline because of death, so that will balance out births. And then there is emigration, so the number of individuals that leave a population. So I'm going to try not to talk about humans for a lot of these examples because there's some exceptions that happen with humans. So we're going to look at maybe a snowshoe hare population or bacteria or a population of maple trees. So we'll try to use other organisms than humans, but all of those four processes, births and deaths, immigration and emigration, happen in all different populations. So growth happens when the resources are greater than the population demands. And populations can grow very, very fast if they've got resources. So given unlimited resources, all populations would grow. Some populations would grow very quickly. Think of mosquitoes, fish, other insects. If there's unlimited resources, they have what's called a very high biotic potential. They can increase their population very, very quickly. And there's other populations like elephants that even if they're given unlimited resources, their biotic potential is lower, so they're not going to increase as quickly. So when we look at population growth, there's two main types that we're going to look at. We're going to look at something called exponential growth. And here's the case where the population is increasing by a fixed percentage every year. And we get something that's called a J-curve. So the population will do something like that and increase quicker and quicker and quicker. And there's also something called logistic growth. And here's where something called the carrying capacity comes in. And they're characterized by something called an S-curve. So what will happen here, a population will start to grow, but some limiting factor kicks in, and that population levels off at a steady state. So when we look at the population growth, here's what we're looking at. So the first one is the idea of the exponential growth. So this is sometimes called a J-curve. There's no limits yet. So as we're seeing, there's unlimited growth potential. Usually this is very high biotic potential. A lot of times new ecosystems that are opened up after a disturbance will show exponential growth. These happen in species where there is high biotic growth potential and they can take off. So as I said before, mosquitoes, fish, insects that have lots of offspring have a high potential and they can increase very quickly, and their growth curve may look like a J. The next one down here, letter B, is logistic growth, and that starts off the same as the J-curve, very, very quick increase, but it levels off. So we see the leveling off right here, and so we get the characteristic S-curve. And this is when resources are limited. So if there's not unlimited resources, at some point some of the organisms are going to die off, and they've reached what's called the carrying capacity. So that's the ability of an ecosystem to support individuals. And if resources are limited, every habitat will have a certain carrying capacity that they can support. The next one that I hadn't mentioned before, but we can talk about linear growth. So here's kind of the straight line. So this is just stable, consistent growth. You don't see this very often in nature. And then the last one I'll mention, because we'll talk about predator-prey relationship, is this boom and bust growth. So this is population growth where the population goes way, way up and then down. It's kind of like a roller coaster, up and down. And we see this a lot of times in predator-prey when species are being predated upon and their populations go down and then they rebound very, very quickly. So now let's go through and look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first one we're going to look at is the exponential growth, the J curve. So on this, the steeper the curve, the faster the rate of growth. So if we were to look at this first red line that's up here, that's showing a very, very fast rate of growth. It's very steep, and those individuals have a high biotic potential. We could look at another group, another population, and maybe we've got a graph that looks something like that, the blue line that was just added. So they both reach the same numbers here and here. They both have the same number in the population, but the red line got there faster. They're increasing much more quickly. And we can even add a third line, so I'll add a black line in here, that if we look at that, this one is increasing even more slowly. It still reaches the same numbers out here. It still reaches the same population, but it's just not increasing quite as quickly. So the steepness of the curve gives us an idea of how fast that population can be growing if it's exponential. So this is a situation where maybe the population is increasing by 10% every year, or maybe it's doubling every 20 years. And we'll get this kind of growth where there is a slow lag phase at the beginning, followed by this explosion where the growth starts to take off. So here's another one for exponential growth, and this is showing it in terms of generations. So this is 1 through 11 generations, and we can see through generation 8 and even 9 over here, there's relatively little perceived growth. So through here and even here, the population hasn't grown that much, but then all of a sudden in the span of 2 generations, we go from being less than 10,000 to having 60,000. That's what exponential growth does. You'll see this initial kind of lag phase followed by this population explosion. Here is the world population growth. So here's for humans. So if we go back 10,000 BC, way over here, there are only 5 million individuals estimated. And as we go forward through time at 1 AD, right here, there's about 250 million. And we didn't hit 1 billion people until about 1800. So, just over 200 years ago. But look what has happened in that time since. So we are almost right here. We're just below 7.3 billion. And right now, the human population is still increasing exponentially. So we are in this time of very, very extreme growth, and who knows, there's projections, as you can see on here, that says by 2050 we may have as many as 9.2 billion people on the planet. So it's something to think about, and it's important to have these ideas of understanding how this growth can take place as we go through. Now, what if there are limits to population growth? What if there is competition for resources? There's not unlimited resources. More often than not, this is what we actually see in nature. And here's where that logistic growth, or the S curve, comes in. Because this takes into account this idea of the carrying capacity. So we have this lag phase. We have this exponential phase where the population increases very, very quickly, but then it levels off when we reach what's called carrying capacity. So this is the maximum population that a habitat can support. And it will vary from species to species. It depends upon the resources that are available in a habitat. One area may have a higher carrying capacity for moose than another area. So it depends on the habitat and the species as well. And here's kind of a breakdown again of those phases. So again, we have the lag phase, and here from generations 1 through 5, we have this time of very, very rapid growth from generations 5 through 12 or 13 on this picture to this point. And then we've got the stationary phase where it reaches carrying capacity and the population levels off. Now, many times that population won't just level off and stay stable. We'll get what's called a sawtooth curve. and the population will jump above and then it'll drop below, and it's a little bit uneven. It doesn't vary a lot around the carrying capacity, but it goes up and down and will react to differences from year to year in the amount of food or cover mates available for that specific species. So there's a logistic curve with a kind of little bit of instability at the end called the sawtooth curve. And here's another one that actually has the carrying capacity written in, just to give you an idea. So this is days, so this is probably paramecium. So this is the per milliliter of medium. So you can see by the time we reach just about 12 days, it's reached its maximum population. There's 200 individuals, and it really doesn't change from that point out. So it's reached its carrying capacity. Good. So as we look at that one, now we can add a little bit of predation in. So now we're going to get the last trend that we're going to look at, predator-prey cycles. So this would be an example of boom and bust, or fluctuating populations. So on the graph that we see here, the green line is the snowshoe hare, and the red line is its predator, the lynx. And as you can see, especially with the hare, we get some years where the population is very, very high, followed very quickly a couple years later with a population that's very low down here. So we've got a boom and a bust. And if you look, what happens to the lynx population shortly after we reach this high point about 1986? Well, because there's lots of snowshoe hare, we get lots of lynx, and lots of lynx will eat lots of snowshoe hare. So what happens to the snowshoe hare population? It crashes down. And then there's a little bit of lag as the number of snowshoe hare goes down. What happens to the number of lynx that can be supported? Well, it lags behind, but it crashes too. So these two populations are kind of in a lockstep together, going boom and bust as the snowshoe hare are predated upon, which causes the population to go down, and the lynx population falls in response to that. So here is another example. So here's hare and fox, and this one, I like this one because it's a little bit larger, and you can kind of see the examples better here, that you've got these really large fluctuations, the blue line in the prey species, and the predator lags behind. It has a boom and bust, but its changes aren't as great. So you'll always see the prey will usually vary more than the predator in these boom and bust situations. So there's a kind of a first look at population growth, the types of growth that we can see. So the three main ones that you should remember are an exponential growth, which is characterized by a J curve. We've got logistic growth, which is characterized by an S curve, and it reaches a carrying capacity. And then we've got the boom and bust growth curves that are characteristic of predator-prey relationships there. So again, thank you for your time, and we will talk to you soon.